see how it works. Matthew 16 and 18. Ephesians 3:21. Genesis 3:15. These are pivotal, are very strong promises in the Bible. What we call the Ishah covenant. The Ishah covenant. We talked about that yesterday morning, Brother Ray.
Yes, sir.
The Ishah covenant. What is the Ishah covenant? The Ishah covenant.
Well, Ishah is Abrahamic. That's
Ishah.
Abraham,
No,
right?
no.
I mean, not Abraham. That's Adam.
No, Ishah.
It's the woman.
Woman. That's right. Woman.
Ish
The covenant
is
through the
man.
woman.
Ishah. Okay, I got it.
Genesis 3:15.
Yeah.
Genesis 3:15. Remember that story. We have, and you read part of the book of Enoch and scared the daylights out of you. All right, because it's for real. This is for real. Genesis 3:15 says, and Jehovah is talking. Jehovah Elohim now. He says, and he's speaking to a congregation of how many?
Oh, no.
Huh?
One.
A congregation of who?
3.
At least 3. And of course we know angels and we know spirits and all around there. Everybody's hearing this story. Angels. We know the angels heard it because over there in Genesis 6, the chapter, we find out that they're trying to circumvent God again. Okay? So, and we studied this deep, didn't we, Christina? We went into this deeply. Genesis 3:15 says, and I will put hatred between the woman and between you and between her seed and your seed and her seed. Your seed is what?
Antichrist.
The Antichrist, but what else?
Satan's offspring.
Every one of the sons of Satan that has been in the, I don't know how many there have been. If you talk to an ex-Muslim, they will swear that Muhammad was actually a son of Satan. Now, between your seed and her seed, it's singular there. But we've had angels cohabit with women, Genesis the 6th chapter, and we've had the race of Nephilim. Now, Nephilim hadn't been nice guys, have they? Nowhere you're going to find anything about a good Nephilim. They're all wicked. And they introduced many, many things in the human race, many wicked things. Did they not, Peyton?
Mm-hmm.
Did you read some of that?
Yeah, I read some of
Yes.
that. Yes.
It's for real, isn't it?
Yes.
Is it real for the 21st century? Yeah. It was real back there in 6,000 years ago or however long it was, and it's real for today too. It's still the same. Still the same. So we see all of this great, masterful war. The war of the worlds. The war of the worlds. God's world, God's order against Satan's order. We see all of this. And we see it, and we studied it in Genesis, the 6th chapter, and then the flood came. Remember, the flood came? Then after the flood, God sets up human government. And what happened in this human government? Who was a bad actor? Who was the main bad actor? What's his name? Nimrod. And where do we get this Madonna and child worship business? Nimrod and his mother. They worshiped Nimrod and his mother. Yes. Anyway, we see all of this, and it comes down. Now, all of the, what we call the evolution of theology and Christendom that we see here comes not, didn't originate then. It originated way yonder back. And it's just what we call Reformed theology. Again. Regurgitated theology again. Over and over and over again. And we see the forces of evil against the forces of good. And yet God is totally just in it. And many people have asked me, I don't believe in God, or made this statement, I don't believe in God because if there was a God, He wouldn't let all this go on. Whose fault is all of this that we see today? Whose fault is it?
Ours.
Hmm?
Ours.
Well, it's individually ours, but who is the god of this age?
Satan.
Satan. Who is the god of all disease? Satan. What are viruses and bacteria and everything? They are fallen life forms that are attacking you physically. Fallen life forms. And the Lord gave man how many years to live, basically, in this age? What? 70 years. Now, if you're over 70 years old, you're beaten out. I am, see? I made it finally. I finally made it. I didn't think I'd ever make it. But I made my promised time. Not left up to me, it was the Lord. That's all I can say about that. 70 years. And we see mankind, beginning before the flood, they lived over 900 years. Many of them didn't they? What's the oldest man in the Bible? Methuselah. How long did Methuselah live? 969 years. What does his name mean?
After my death, it'll come. Or
When he is dead, it shall come to pass, or man of the dark. In other words, he's going to die. But when Methuselah dies, what's going to happen?
the flood.
The flood's going to come. Who was his father? Enoch. All right. Enoch named him. How long did Enoch preach that the flood was coming?
Long time.
300 years. I want you to understand from the time that Methuselah was born until the flood came is how many years? 969 years, and they had warning for 969 years that judgment was coming. What did they do? Nothing. They just went on with their lives just exactly the way they did before. And the flood came. Now, do you think there were believers outside of that ark after the flood came?
No.
According to Peter, there was. Jesus went down and preached to those people that were held captivity in what we call Sheol or Hades. Now, that's not purgatory, people. Purgatory is another invention of false religion to get money. That's basically it. It's what manipulation of the masses, and that's what you will see in religion. False religion is always manipulation of the masses. True New Testament churches are what kind of a polity? Brother Ray?
Congregational rule.
Congregational or democratic rule? The congregation rules itself. Each one. Does that congregation answer to any other earthly body?
No.
No. If they did, would it be scriptural? No. How about in church and state? Is church and state, is that a good doctrine or a bad doctrine? Where did that come from? Where did it go all the way back to who?
Constantine.
Where did it go? Yeah, it started with Constantine in the church age. Where did he go back? Babylon. Nimrod. Church and state. Again. Church and state. We see all of it go back. All go back to one premise. A premise of false religion. So we looked at Genesis 3:15. I will put hatred between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. And you shall bruise him as to the heel, but he shall bruise you as to the head, a death-dealing blow. In the end, Jesus is going to win. I want you to know that. Jesus is going to win. We live in terrible controversy in the world today, don't we? Even in our own little universe, which is your soul and spirit and body. That's your universe. Did you know that? You're triune, just like God is triune. That's your universe. In that little universe, do you have a wrestling match? Yes, we do. We have wrestling matches within that universe. You come on up now. We studied and we saw the flood come because of the Nephilim. And man had become extremely wicked. And then we come over here. They were supposed to scatter and multiply. Where is the largest concentration of evil and wickedness? Where? In false religion, but where? Where is it?
Where is it?
Around the
What's the
Fertile
promise?
Crescent.
Scatter and multiply.
Tower of Babel.
Don't build big cities. And they build a big city. In the big cities, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, these are the garbage pits of America. But you look at it in Amman, Jordan. You look at it in all of these big cities. You have problems in these big cities. People gather together and see how they can rip each other off. That's the story. New York City. This is crime, major crime and debauchery. Well, so God divided the earth. He confused the languages, as we know. He divided the earth, and then we have continents. Our continents began at this time. And God divided. Now, what would have happened if, why didn't God leave the world Pangea?
Because they would have went back together again.
Why didn't the world, God leave the world Pangea, or all land and all water in the other place? Why? Mankind probably would have killed each other completely by now. They would have completely killed each other. They didn't have to go across the ocean. Civilization was greatly enhanced by dividing the continents. Get this in your head. Civilization was greatly enhanced and divided because they didn't get to each other. They didn't kill each other quite so much. What was the most populated continent in the world? The Americas.
Yes.
There was 150 million people. Matter of fact, during almost all of natural history, Western and Eastern civilization, America was more heavily populated than the rest of the world. Why? The greatest cities and wars and religious controversy was going on in Europe and the Middle East. In America, North America was pretty much democratic rule. South America, Mesoamerica, and South America, there were kingdoms down there. There were kings, and there were great cities, but there was no disease here. No disease.
Because they didn't live in big cities.
They didn't live in big cities as a general rule. And bacteria and viruses are fallen life forms. Remember that. These things that when you catch a cold, when you catch a virus, the flu and all that stuff, these are fallen life forms. Cancer is a fallen life form. And cancer is a terrible fallen life form. Because cancer, you catch a cold, and you sneeze or cough, and the next guy gets it. And that virus goes from person to person, and it doesn't normally kill the host, does it? But what does cancer do? It's like sin. It kills the host. If it's not checked somehow in the world, it will kill the host that's hosting it. It will kill that person. That's one of the greatest examples of sin there is cancer. And how about these boils that afflicted people at different times in the world? Boils. What is this boils? That's a disease of the blood. And it is staph infection. We're going to get into that as we go down into Egypt and we see the plagues and all that. We're going to look at that. That was staph infection. That's a fallen life form. Okay? Bacteria and these infections are fallen life form. Now we have the earth in a different atmosphere. We have people living basically 70, 80, 90, 100 years. We have Abraham living quite a while. And so God calls Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldees, doesn't he? Yes or no? Did he live there?
Yeah.
What's down in Ur of the Chaldees? Tell me about the Ur of the Chaldees. Anybody know about that? Brother Roger, you ever study about that? That was the center of Babylon. Okay. Now, what's down there, Brother Ray?
Well, that's from a Christian, ancient cities.
They had ancient cities down there. There was ancient cities. There were ancient libraries.
They're very advanced.
The biblical critics will say to you that Abraham could not have received God's promises or anything. There was no written language in Abraham's time, but we know the law of Hammurabi was in existence. And he followed that law. And the largest library in the world at that time was in the Ur of the Chaldees. What else did they do over there? They had indoor plumbing. They had libraries. They had indoor plumbing. These people over here are the ones that invented the roads and the postal system and everything. They were doing all this stuff over there. They were communicating, and they were conquering too. We have all these great empires back in ancient times. Well, anyway, God tells Abraham, get out of here. So Abraham didn't quite go far enough, did he? He told him, go over there to the land that I will show you. And where did the old boy stop? In Haran. Haran. Now, what's over there in Haran? There's a bunch of shysters. One of them was called Whitey. Laban. Okay? So he goes there, and his father dies there. Finally, God takes his life, and his brother died, and his father died. There's some dead people here, and they're not living as old as they're supposed to live. Their people are dying younger. And then he goes on down into Canaan. Now tell me a little bit about the land of Canaan, or Canaan. Canaan. You remember anything about that, Schrader? What about this land of Canaan? What about Genesis, the 9th chapter, verses 24 onward there? Do you remember anything about that, Christine?
Isn't that where the Nephilim are? And
No, Genesis, the 9th chapter.
oh, I don't remember.
What's it say there in Genesis, the 9th chapter? Brother Roger, you remember that? Genesis, the 9th chapter? This is where the descendants and the inhabitants of Canaan, before they exist. Now, they haven't existed yet. They aren't even born yet. But God knows what these guys are going to be like.
Oh,
Yeah,
I remember.
the Canaan.
Yeah.
Canaan is a progeny of Ham. Now, some people, especially the Americans here, and the Anglo-Saxons, believed at one time that anybody was of a darker race was cursed of God, and they were cursed to become slaves. And they acted that way too. They treated that way. Well, my great uncle, John Paul Jones, he was sold into slavery, and he was white. He was Scots. But his family sold him into slavery because they needed money, and they lived in Scotland. And they sold him to a slave shipper. And he went to Africa to get slaves, because this was common practice. They used these slaves in Europe. But what were the most sought-after slaves in Europe? Weren't blacks. American Indians. American Indians were the most sought-after slaves in America, in Europe. Did you know that? American Indians were the most sought-after slaves in Europe. They used them for runners because they could really run good. They would have them as coachmen. Anybody had an American Indian as a coachman in Europe, boy, that was really cool, having one of these savages. And they would take these savage Indians over there, and they would put them in pits with wild bears and lions and bulls. This is real history, people. Have you ever heard this before? Read the story of Pocahontas and read the story of early America and find out if this is not true. They took those Indians saved those people's lives when they came to America. And they turned around and enslaved them, took them back to Europe, and used them for novelties. And they take whole slave ships back there. They used these American Indians for novelties. And there were more American Indian slaves in America than there ever were black slaves. Did you know that? And up until 1869 in the state of California, they were still selling Indian slaves on the auction block in Los Angeles in 1869. Now, the Civil War was over in 1865, wasn't it? Was it really over slavery, or was it over states' rights? There was still slavery in America after that. There is slavery in America today. Did you know that? There is slavery in America today because we have Muslims here under Sharia law, and they hold slaves. They hold slaves. Talk about slavery a little bit. The history of the ungodly practice of slavery. Go down here to Smart and Final or Walmart, and you watch these Muslim women go in there and they'll buy 15 or 20 gallons of milk. You see what you're talking about? You know why?
Yeah, why?
Because every Muslim man can have 4 legal Muslim wives and all the concubine slaves that he can afford.
What does that have to do with so much milk? That they buy?
All the kids, all the children, all the children.
More families to feed.
4 to 10 families to feed. And they have all the children they can have. They go in and put in what they call settlers. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves. But this is slavery. We're talking about slavery. Slavery never ended. When Dr. Livingston went to Africa, you know what his greatest obstacle was? In Africa? Arab slave traders. Arab slave traders. He killed a bunch of them. You ever hear that story? Stanley and Livingston? They hated him. They hated him. He killed a lot of Arab slave traders. He was trying to push England, Great Britain, into releasing and forbidding slavery, and they finally did. Long before America ever gave up the practice. Long before that. Long before America ever gave up the practice. If you were an American Indian in the state of California, or Spanish, you know why Spanish couldn't have any rights in California, Christine? You're from early California, you're a friend of mine, aren't you?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Joaquin Marietta and Zorro, the legend is real. You know why Spanish could not have any property in the state of California? Well, first of all, America stole California from Mexico and Texas. But why didn't the Spanish, why were they not allowed to own any property in California?
Was it the church that owned it?
No. They figured they were at least 1/4 Indian.
Oh, they did.
That's right. And so they could not own property. And the only way an Indian could exist in California is on one of them slave plantations they called missions. Slavery.
Right.
Slavery. Slavery. Manipulation of the masses. It goes all the way back to the period of time we're talking about right now. Back to Abraham's day. Did Abraham have slaves?
Yes.
Many, many slaves. Onesimus, Philemon in the New Testament. Onesimus. Well, who was Onesimus? Do you remember him?
Yeah.
He was a slave. Philemon's slave. Paul wrote Philemon a letter and said, please free this slave. He is now your brother, not your property. And he ran away. And Onesimus means what? What does Onesimus mean?
Honorable or?
Honorable and profitable. But Onesimus had run away with himself. He ran off. We had an American president that was a former slave. Did you know that? Andrew Johnson. We had one of the greatest statesmen in America that was a slave and ran away. And by the way, these are not white slaves. I mean black slaves. These are white slaves. That was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a runaway slave. A runaway slave. Now, my great uncle, John Paul Jones, his name was John Paul, he went to Africa. And he brought back a whole shipload, and it was terrible cargo. The way they changed them in the bottom of that ship, they just chained them together, back and forth, underneath in levels, just chained together until they got back there. But there was a problem in Africa. There was a disease, a parasite in Africa that was not introduced to America yet, and it hadn't even got into England yet. You know how this disease got into England and America? Because of greed. in slavery. And that was what, Brother Roger? Malaria. That means, in Latin, means bad air. And it's a vivax infection. Now, in America, we had mosquitoes. Anopheles quadrimaculatus is the mosquito species that carries malaria. And it's not the mosquito that carries malaria. It's the vivax infection, and there are several kinds of vivax infections. But it is a worm in their gut. And when a mosquito bites you, they put this deadening thing in you. You know, it deadens them as they go into your pores, your skin, and bite you. And they go down and suck your blood, but they're putting blood in you at the same time. And that way, if that mosquito is infected with a vivax infection, it goes into your blood. It goes into your blood. And every so many days, there's a cycle in your system where your blood changes. And you go into these threshing fevers every so many days. And the fevers will kill you. My cousin, Fred Waite, the man that rode in the Lincoln County War, died of malaria. When John Paul Jones shipped these black people back to England, every white sailor died on the ship. And so he had to train the Africans to be sailors. And when he got there, they were so happy because he had saved the cargo, yet all the white people, that he came back and he was a slave. All of them are slaves now. Only on everything on that ship's a slave. The white one and all the black ones are slaves. But when he got there, they freed him and said, okay, you paid for your indenturement. And so they sent him back a time or two back to Africa. And he finally just left that and came to America. And he was the one that started the American Navy, John Paul Jones. When we had the American Revolution, he says, we need to whip England on their own shores. Quit letting them come over here. Stop those ships, supply ships, stop them. You give me enough ships and I'll go whip them. Well, they gave him one ship. And he stole a whole bunch of more ships. He confiscated them from the English. One ship after another. And he ended up over there in Ireland and Scotland and was whipping them. And if you studied American history and John Paul Jones, remember his ship was sinking? 2/3 of his men were killed. And the British admiral asked him, do you surrender, Mr. Jones? He said, I haven't yet begun to fight. And he whipped him and took his ship with hardly any men. Napoleon Bonaparte said, if I'd had John Paul Jones as the admiral of my navy, I could have whipped the world. Because he was invincible. Totally invincible. But he was a former slave. They came over here, and that's where my family came from. From New York and Maryland, and they went down in North Carolina, in New Bern, and John Paul Jones had a farm down there too, with his family. And my family, one of my great-great-grandfather, Smith Paul, ran off because he had a new stepmother that wanted to get him hung because she didn't like him. So he ran off and lived with the Chickasaw Indians, those savages. Except these savages in Mississippi owned great plantations and great homes and villages and towns. And because of the slavery, and because of the farming of tobacco, the land wore out real fast. And so they were pushing inward from the eastern shores. When the first Anglo-Saxons came to the American continent, we're going way back in history now. When they came to the American continent, they saw great cities and lights all up and down the eastern coast. Those were Indian cities. And they had great roads all the way across America, all the way out to this, from the east to the west. You know, we had trailblazers. Kit Carson. We have Jeremiah Johnson. He was also called Liver-Eating Johnson. Did you know that? Because he killed Indians and ate their liver. And we have Walker, Joseph Walker. That Walker Pass is named up out of him. You go up through Isabella and you go over Walker Pass. Now, all of these guys didn't discover anything. All they did was follow Indian trails. The roads were already there. They didn't discover anything, but they came. And as you see in the history of mankind, slavery, talking about slavery today, how slavery has affected the whole world on every continent. Every continent. Every place. Now, the Bible says that they would scatter all the people here in the languages and the division of the continents. You know who went the furthest of all the races? Who scattered further? And their languages were more confused than anyone else, any other people. Who were they? The Hamites. All the way into the South Pacific. All the way into China and all of this. All of these people. And by the way, these savages, all of these savages, did all the inventions that ever been made by mankind. Did you know that? They invented everything that's ever been invented. A white man, an Anglo-Saxon, never invented anything. Nothing. They might have improved the inventions. When the Anglo-Saxons came to America, when they came to Japan, China, when they went down into Australia and New Zealand, the Australians down there, most of them trace their lineage by the prisoners that were sent down there to what these were called penal colonies down there. Slave colonies. That they had been taken from England and Ireland, and they brought them down in there, and they had these great slave plantations down there. They were called penal colonies. The work farms. They were in prison down there. And they were treated pretty badly, but those indigenous people were treated much worse because they stole the farms. They stole it all. Over 70% of the medicine today that you use, that you buy across the counter, is American Indian or indigenous people from the Hamite race, not from the Anglo-Saxons. Did you know that? All of the greatest ancient cultures that ever lived were Hamite races. The first great culture was what? What was the first great empire? One of the earliest empires.
Was it in China?
Dublin? Aztec and Mayan.
Egypt. Assyria. We go all the way down. We study these great empires. But we're not even thinking about America, are we? We're not thinking about this continent over here. The Smithsonian Institute squelched any notion that in the Americas there were great populations of people. Because when you go into and conquer a land, you've got to make them less than human. So you see, we're talking about slavery today, how slavery has affected the world. Have you learned something so far? Slavery is a wicked practice. Who was the first person in the Bible to implement slavery? Who was he? Cain. The guy that killed Abel? Cain. And he went into the land of Nod, and he took his wife, and he went over there, and we find out these people are conquering people, and this is before mankind is given the right to eat animals. And they're hunting men, and they're hunting animals. And in the book of Enoch, what are they doing? These Nephilim.
Same thing.
They're hunting men, and they're hunting animals, and they're drinking their blood and sucking their bodies' carcasses dry of blood. This is the vampire stories. That's who these people were. And they are slavers. They're slavers. Cain, when he was cursed by God, you might say, now if you've talked to the Mormons, if you talk to many of the Southern Baptists in the South for 200 or 300 years, you find out that Cain, that mark that God put on Cain, that he turned him black. But that's not what happens. What was that mark? Brother Roger, you remember what that mark was?
The mark of protection.
It was a mark of protection.
No.
It wasn't a curse. It's a protection. Some way God sealed him with some type of mark on him, whether it said Jehovah across his forehead or whatever it was. You don't kill this man. You will answer to me. But they went out killing people, didn't they? That wicked, wicked people went out killing and enslaving other people. What was Cain? What did he do for a living?
Farmer.
He was a farmer. And God said, I'll curse the land double because of you. So his farming wouldn't work quite so well, would it? He'd got twice as many weeds as anybody else, twice as many problems as anybody else. And so what did they do? I'll show you, God, I'll enslave people, and I'll have them do my work, and I'll sit back as the patron. This sound familiar? Europe. All Europe, Northern Europe, existed on slavery. Even after Christendom had moved in there. Because when Christendom moved into Europe, after the first few hundred years, what happened? We have the church and state now. And we also have these Vikings. What are these Vikings? They're murderers.
Fallen black ones.
They're murderers. They're big, tall Europeans that carried the hatches. The big hatchets. Big axes. They Vikinged with it. The Vikings came all the way over here to Americas. The Orientals, the Chinese, came over here to Americas. In the 12 and 1300s, the Chinese had the greatest, the black race, the dark races, the Hamite races, had the greatest ships and fleets in the world. The Ming dynasty had over 318 ships in that dynasty, and the ships were bigger than anything Europe had ever seen. And they float around looking at other worlds and explore. And they go look over there. You know what the Chinese said about Europe? We conquer those heathens, those stinking people. They smelled. But there's nothing there we want. They don't have anything that we want. They don't have anything we want. And down into South America we go. What drew Europe to South America? You ever hear of Mount Potosi? Mount Potosi? There's a Mount Potosi over there by Las Vegas. Mount Potosi was almost pure silver. The only thing that China wanted, they had just a debunk monetary system. Now, let me tell you something about the Chinese. Chinese practice slavery too. Have you been in the Bill Lee's? You been in the Bill Lee's? Have you ever gone to Bill Lee's bamboo chopsticks down here in Bakersfield? Go to Bill Lee's bamboo chop there. There's a horse there, and there's a warrior there. And this king set up these statues, and every one of these statues has a different face on it and everything. They're all Chinese, but they have different expressions in face. They represented real people. And this whole city was buried, and that's a facsimile of some of the horses, the war horses they had. They had better weapons than anything in Europe. Who invented gunpowder? Was it a white man? Chinese. Who invented ovens and cast iron stoves? The Chinese. Who invented the flush toilet? Chinese.
What about paper?
Who invented paper? The Chinese. Who invented money, printed money? The Chinese. But the Chinese had trouble with the printed money, and like we have in America today, you know, if we'd only pay attention to history, we wouldn't have to relive it. The Chinese had problems. Are you enjoying this? Are you learning something? Just like a history lesson and everything all at once. We're talking about slavery today. Slavery, the history of slavery. The Chinese had problem with their money. Now, there was what we call fixed pricing in China. And you could go from one province, one state, one county to another, and you could sell your house here, and you could go right over there with this script money that they had and buy another one just exactly like it. You wouldn't have to move anything. You could just go buy it and refurnish it and everything with the script money that you had. But when they got ready to go buy something and exchange this money for something, they had to have wheelbarrows full of coins. And the coins had holes in them, and they were on great strings, wires. And they had to carry these things. Tons of of brass and copper coins. And silver and gold is worth a lot more. So they were just being burdened down by carrying this money around. If it wasn't printed money, the solid money, what we call real currency, was heavy to carry. But this printed money, but what backs up the printed money? They couldn't have a Fort Knox big enough to hold enough brass and copper. So the Spanish went down and enslaved the people in Mount Potosi in South America and used them up. They would work them until they died. And they would trade that silver. You remember that these Spanish galleons go back into Europe and going all over with this big, heavy loads of silver ingots. That's where it came from at that time. They take it over there, and then the Chinese would trade for that because they needed money. Real silver. Because you could have a block of silver, and they were taking this in Europe, and Europe was so far behind into the rest of the world, while the Babylonian, the Egyptians, they had coins, didn't they? The Romans had coins. But in Europe, they took a silver ingot, and they take and chop off a piece of it and say, there it is, and weigh it. How would you like to have to when you buy groceries, have to take a silver ingot with you and carry this like this and chop off a piece every time you want a loaf of bread or cheese or whatever? It's because the Chinese and those Hamite races that you have coinage today and paper money. Now America, we're having a little problem with inflation, aren't we? What do we need to do? Not what John Maynard Keynes says. He said gold and silver. We go by the Keynes system of economics. Did you know that? The John Maynard Keynes system of economics. And he said gold and silver are savage monetary developments here. We don't need that. We're going to have a Federal Reserve System. And we're going to have a bank, a state national bank. And we're going to make our money worth what we want it to make. And when you've got to go by the dollar, we can make that dollar worth 10 cents or we can make it worth $10. And it's all up to us, not to you. We can control the currency, control the tax rate. You're taxed without you even knowing. John Maynard Keynes, system, the Federal Reserve System. Our dollars used to be backed. There was a gold certificate and a silver certificate. And after John Kennedy, the one that took his place, after he got killed, we no longer had a silver standard anymore. You no longer have silver quarters and silver dollars and silver dimes. They're all plated. It didn't work in China, and it won't ever work here either. And all of it is over manipulation of the masses and slavery. Slavery has been a curse of humankind. Slavery. A curse of humankind. Do you have any questions right here? You think slavery is a good thing? How about democracy? Democracy. What is a democracy? What is a democracy? The only purest form of democracy you will ever see is in a Baptist church.
Amen.
Really? You ought to come up there to the Highline Missionary Baptist Church one time when we vote. You saw that happen up there, didn't you, Brother Roger? Did I tell them what to do? They do it. They do it. The church does it. They vote. Boy, that would work really good in America, wouldn't it? That's what we say we do. But we elect these senators. You know what a senator is? What is a senator?
Overpaid puppet.
What is a senator?
Representative.
It's not a representative. A senator is an elder. A senator says that I know what you need better than you do.
Oh, like that.
Well, that's it. This is what we call a technocracy, that I know what you need better than you do. And I will make my own mind up what needs to happen in this country. That's what a senator is. Did you know that before this class?
I knew some of it to that point.
Okay, what is a representative? We have senators and representatives. We have the Senate and the House of Representatives. What do the representatives do?
They're supposed to represent.
They're supposed to represent the constituents where they are elected from. The senator says, I know better than what you need. You don't need. I don't need to answer you people. And then we have this president, this hierarchy system. A hierarchy.
But our founding fathers believed that. They believed that the common man
When America,
really make his own decisions.
when America became a nation, you couldn't vote if you were a woman. You couldn't vote if you didn't own land. Did you know that? So who got the vote?
The rich men.
The rich man. When Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, etc." We the people, where did he get that?
From the Indians.
From the Indians. That was part of the Iroquois Confession of Faith and their democracy that was written way before this country ever became the Iroquois nation. So we the people. By the way, among the Indian people, they had seminaries and colleges. Did you know that? And the women could go to them. And by the way, the women voted. Because it wasn't a slavery. But when you have something that comes out, how long did it take America to get away from that European princes and paupers idea?
Well, we couldn't vote
We're
in the
still here.
1920s, but we're still fighting it.
We're still fighting slavery, aren't we? Today. Slavery is one of the greatest curses of humanity. And slavery was invented by the rascals, by the ungodly buzzards, by the Nephilim and all of this. This is where it all came from, slavery. Do you have a little better understanding about your government today? We're going to get into it all the way down. Yes, Christina?
Then who did the Indians worship? Since we're on somewhat of the Indians.
Okay, it's different. The Indians. Now, I wrote a book called An Introduction to the Thoughts and Customs of the American Indian. I wrote a book about that. Introduction to the Thoughts and Customs of the American Indian, because I am Indian. Now, the Lakota. The father was Wakantanka. The son was Tonka Sheila, and the Holy Spirit was Skantaku Skanskan. Did you know that? The Spirit was that which makes all things alive. In the Bible, the Spirit is that which makes all things alive, isn't it? And the Son is the sacrifice. Indians never killed an animal. Have you ever heard me pray at dinner time?
Yeah.
What do I say?
Still anything.
Father, thank you for what we have. Thank you for the animals that gave their lives for us. Every animal that dies gives its life for you to live. We need to be thankful for that, because God, that animal has spirit, soul, and body. And you're eating its body. But you've destroyed its spirit and soul by doing that. You've done it. You see so many things that from the Hebrew and the Greek languages, you get a lot of more information about the entity of living objects. The Indians, many of them worshiped God. There were no Indians that were atheists at all. They all worshiped God. There were some bad Indians, there's good Indians. Most of them, my family goes all the way back to Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. These were, you know what Crazy Horse was? You know what he was?
A doctor?
No. Crazy Horse. What was Crazy Horse? He was the one that supposedly killed Custer and all his monks. Okay? What was Crazy Horse? What was he? What did he do? What was his occupation?
A warrior?
No.
Something that
He was not a warrior. What was he?
Was he some kind of politician or
He was a preacher.
preacher?
He was a preacher. You know what Sitting Bull was? Sitting Bull was a preacher. They were preachers. They were spiritual leaders of their people. Crazy Horse was even a shirt man. Now ask me what a shirt man is.
It's a person honored with a shirt that's got ribbons tied on it.
Okay, it's a person that was so selfless in the tribe that the women of the tribe would make him a shirt, and they would tie pieces of their hair on it. And this is what the white people call scalp shirts. And they said Crazy Horse wore a scalp shirt. He did not. If you were a shirt man, all the other tribes You had free access to them. You could go through any lands. They would never attack a shirt man. Never attack a shirt man. Because a shirt man was a preacher. He was a spiritual leader of that tribe. And in every way, he was honored, and he led out when they moved from location to location. The shirt man and the pipe carrier and the scout led. By the way, in that book I wrote, that's all that's in there. But he would lead out. And when the missionaries came to this country, the Indians said, wow, these guys really know about God. They got a book. We've been worshiping God all this time, but boy, they got a lot of information here. But you know what they found out? But they were nothing but slavers. They were all slavers. They enslaved them. My family goes Moshuk Chu. That's the sound of the name of Chickasaw, name of my family. And way back in the 13 and 1400s, Hernando de Soto came in down to Alabama and Mississippi, and he lived among the Chickasaw Indians one winter down there. And they put up with him. They put up with these wild hogs. The Spanish always drove hogs in front of them. That's portable food. And they take care of themselves, and they're terrible. You know what devastated the American Indian? It wasn't bullets. It wasn't gunpowder. It was those wild hogs. The hogs carried every disease in the world. And those hogs spread disease all over America. The wild hogs in the South came from Hernando de Soto when he went among in 1539 and 40, I think was the years. In the springtime, he wanted to make slaves out of the Indian warriors. And they whooped the socks off of him and ran him off. And scattered him. Then he went across the Great Plain. And then you hear about the State Plains where he went. Wherever he went, he killed and devastated and spread disease with what hogs he had left, because a lot of them were spread in the South. And there's where you have the razorback hogs of the South today. All these wild hogs in the South. Slavery. The curse of slavery among humankind. The curse of it, as it was. If you're a darker color, you were part of that. You were part of these slaves. Every place the Anglo-Saxons, wherever they went, whether it was the Hawaiian Islands, any place they went, you know what they did? They took every invention that they found there that the Indians, and they tried to improve it. And then they enslaved those people, and they forbid them to speak their language. Does that sound familiar? They forbid them to practice their culture because they told them they were savages and heathens. But who was the savages and the heathens? Sitting Bull one time said, I don't know who these people are, but they must not have souls, because they can take and make a contract, a treaty with us, and they can smoke this pipe. And there's a pipe over there. You can look over there and you can see these pipes. It was what they call ceremonial pipe. Or you ever heard of peace pipes? And they would smoke these pipes. But what was a pipe ceremony? They would take that pipe out and they would take that tobacco out. They'd put that pipe together. And they didn't put the pipe together except when they called God to witness something. They're calling Wakantaka, Takashila, and Skantaku, Skan to witness this event of marriage, of a treaty between people or anything, and they put the pipe together, and kabam, as far as they're concerned, God's right here. And they put tobacco in that pipe, and it wasn't wacky tobacco either. This is tobacco. Okay? This is one. Peyote. They're smoking peyote. They don't smoke peyote.
No, you don't smoke peyote.
Peyote is something you make tea out of, and you drink it, and it starts making you hallucinate and throw up. If you really want something like that, bad as sniffing paint, brother, right? You take that pipe, and you put this tobacco in it, and you go to the four directions. You go to the north and say, Wakantanka, Tonka, Shila, Skan, Taku, Skan, help me to cleanse my life and be white and pure. And to be reasonable in everything I do. Go to the south, to the east. And you go over there and say, the God who brings up the sun every day, we asked you to witness for us. And asked you, you're powerful and almighty God. We asked you to stand here and witness today. Do not let us break this treaty. And then they go to the south. And they go to the south, and all of these have got colors. White, red, or yellow. south green, because everything south is green in it. You go down south, it's green. They knew what south was. South, let us remember our brother and treat him as our brother in our flesh and blood and not as an enemy. And then they go to the west, which the color is what? What color does the sky turn at nighttime? Black. And they go there, help us remember that this may be our last day, and help us to live on Mother Earth and your land the way that you want us to live this day, and help us remember. And then they touch the sky, heaven, which is color blue, and they touch the earth, which is red. And they say, here we are. Now you smoke this pipe. When you breathe that smoke in, when you speak those words that you say you're going to do it, God is your witness. You cannot break this covenant. You cannot. If you break that covenant, you are a non-human. And Sitting Bull says, these people must be something that looks like people, but don't have souls. How would they break their word? How would they smoke that pipe and then do what they do? Slavers. Slavery. Slavery. That's it. Well, that's it for today. The history of slavery and how it's affected us all the way through the church age that we live in today. We haven't got any. We're going to go on there from next week. Do you have any questions? Did you learn something, Phil?
Yes.
All right. How about it? I'm putting Western civilization, anthropology, everything else thrown in the church history class, and I did it before. You remember a little bit of that, Brother Ray?
Yes, sir.
All of that. I remember one time he went up there, you were rebuilding houses, doing construction work, and when you were my church member in New Hope Missionary Baptist Church, you went up there and you were working on this house of woman, and you were explaining and talking about Western civilization, weren't you? And she said, what college you go to? Isn't that what she asked you?
Yeah.
And what did you tell her?
After a while, she actually asked me, I said, where'd you learn all this? We were talking about all the cultures, the Mongoloid, the Tagalog, the English,
Yeah.
all the European and all that. He said, where'd you learn that? Did you go to college or something? I said, no, I learned that in church. I said, you ought to come down here and listen to my pastor. He's pretty good at this stuff.
How many years ago was that?
Yeah, 36,
37 years ago. I'm still doing it.
Yeah.
I hope you learned something today. I hope it enriched your life. I hope it influences your thinking, and I hope it influences your relationship with God. Because it means something, doesn't it?
Well, you know what it does. It just leads to more questions.
That's
Yes.
right.
A very true statement.
I had a boy, he called me on the phone and left a message there this morning, Dr. Phillips. He said, I just wanted to touch bases with you, Brett. Brett came to my class. He was going to Valley Baptist Church for years. He had read the Bible at that time 17 times. And he knew the Bible from cover to cover. And he'd get up there and he'd listen to Roger and Phil preach, and he could say the words they were going to say next. And then he came to my class. Bill Hawkins invited him to my class. And he said, come over here and listen to Dr. Phillips. So he came in there and he listened to my class. And you know what? That boy wouldn't hardly sit still and shut up. He had something he wanted to teach me. After about 6 months with that boy in the classroom, he come out shaking his head one day and he said, I don't know anything. Nothing. I thought I was educated. I have no education at all. Zero. I don't know anything about politics, Western civilization. I don't know anything about anything. Nothing. Well, he learned. You know what he's doing now? He's writing a book on my church history classes. He's going to write that book and publish that book on what I taught in church history. And so you're getting part of it right up front here by the teacher. Does it help you? Is it helping you? I hope it's helping you. I hope it's enriching your lives. All right. Any questions before I turn you loose on the world? Nothing?
Not yet.
Not yet?
Yeah.
Not yet.
Then
Okay.
they-
You learned something, young lady? You learned something tonight. Brother Phil, would you dismiss us in prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, thank you for this lesson today. Thank you for blessing us with knowledge that none of us ever had before, that can enrich our lives